The moment Elias Fairchild put his hand on the small of Esther Harper's back and introduced her as his wife to a room full of dangerous strangers, she felt her heart stop, restart, and then do something entirely unreasonable. It believed him. The year was 1878, and the town of Caldwell, Kansas sat on the edge of the Kishom Trail like a splinter in a thumb, sharp, irritating, and impossible to ignore. It was a place where cattle drives ended and trouble began, where cowboys spent their wages in a single night, and sheriffs looked the other way when the money was good. Esther had arrived on the noon stage from Wichita with nothing but a carpetbag, a determination carved from stone, and a letter in her coat pocket that she had been praying would not turn out to be a lie. The letter had been written by her uncle, Bernard Harper, who had promised her employment as a school teacher in a town called Millbrook, 12 miles south of Caldwell. He had described Millbrook as a growing settlement, decent and respectable, with a proper schoolhouse already built and waiting. What Esther had not known when she boarded that stage was that her uncle had written the letter 4 months ago, and in those 4 months Millbrook had suffered a fire that took half the town, including the schoolhouse, straight to the ground. She had learned this from the stage driver when he set her bags down in the dirt outside the Caldwell depot. "Sorry, miss," he had said, not sounding particularly sorry at all. "Millbrook's not much of anything right now. You might want to figure out your situation before the next stage comes through, which won't be until Thursday." It was Monday. Esther stood on the boardwalk with her carpetbag in her hand and the Kansas sun hammering down on her dark hair, and she tried very hard not to let her composure crack. She was 23 years old, the daughter of a Boston schoolteacher who had died of typhoid fever the previous winter, and a mother who had followed him to the grave not 3 months later. She had no family left except for Uncle Bernard, who had not actually written to her since December, and whose address she was beginning to suspect was no longer accurate either. She had $17, 1 good dress, 2 practical ones, a volume of Shakespeare she could not bring herself to leave behind, and the kind of pride that did not allow her to weep in public. What she did not have was a plan. She picked up her bag, squared her shoulders the way her mother had always told her to do when the world felt like it was collapsing, and walked into the nearest establishment that looked like it might sell food. It happened to be the Dusty Creek Saloon, which was not precisely the establishment a respectable young woman from Boston ought to walk into alone in 1878. But Esther had already decided that the rules of proper Boston society were going to have limited application to her situation going forward. The saloon was dim and smelled of sawdust and whiskey, and something she could not quite identify but suspected was trouble. There were perhaps a dozen men inside despite the early afternoon hour, most of them gathered around 2 large tables near the back where a card game was in progress. The bartender, a heavy-set man with a handlebar mustache that curled up at the ends like small question marks, looked at her with open astonishment. "Can I help you, miss?" he said. "I would like something to eat," she said, "and information if you have it." She had just settled onto a stool at the bar and begun negotiating the price of a bowl of beef stew when the doors swung open, and 3 men walked in wearing expressions that Esther, even with her limited experience of the frontier, recognized immediately as the kind that preceded violence. The man in the center was the one who commanded attention. He was tall, rangy, wearing a coat that had seen better decades, with cold, pale eyes and a jaw that looked like it had been chipped from granite. He had a badge on his chest, which should have been reassuring, but was not, because the badge was dented and tilted at an angle that suggested it had not been pinned there with any great care for the law it was supposed to represent. "Harold Vance," the bartender said softly, and his voice had dropped several registers. Around the room, Esther noticed chairs being pushed back quietly, men finding reasons to become very interested in their boots. Deputy Harold Vance ran his pale eyes around the room, and they landed on Esther with an unpleasant sort of surprise. "Well now," he said, walking toward the bar with the loose-hipped swagger of a man who was accustomed to rooms parting for him. "Who do we have here?" Esther set down her spoon. "Esther Harper," she said, with the precise diction of someone who had been taught to speak in front of classrooms. "I arrived on the noon stage from Wichita." "Did you now?" Vance said. He leaned against the bar beside her, close enough that she could smell the stale tobacco on his coat. "Traveling alone, Miss Harper." "At present," she said carefully. Vance's mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile. "At present," he repeated, like he was tasting the words. "Well, I'd hate for a pretty woman to be alone in Caldwell. It's not always a safe town for a woman by herself, not without someone to look after her interests." What he meant was perfectly clear, and it turned Esther's blood cold. It was precisely at that moment that the saloon doors swung open again, and a man walked in who was nothing at all like Harold Vance. He was perhaps 28, solidly built but without the thickness that came from indolence, the kind of build that came from actual work. He wore a brown hat with a sweat-stained brim, a faded blue shirt, canvas trousers tucked into worn boots, and a gun belt that sat on his hip with the ease of something he had been wearing since he was old enough to carry the weight. His face was all clean angles and sun-darkened skin, with dark eyes that moved across the room in a single practice sweep, and landed immediately on the situation at the bar, with the quick assessment of a man who could read a room the way Esther read a page. He did not hesitate. He crossed the room in 6 long strides, and before Esther could form a complete thought, his hand was on the small of her back, warm, steady, certain, and he was saying, with a voice as easy and unhurried as a summer creek, "There you are, darling. I've been looking all over for you." Esther's mouth opened. The man looked down at her with dark eyes that were doing 2 things simultaneously, asking her with absolute urgency to play along, and promising her with complete sincerity that she could trust him. It was an extraordinary amount of communication to pack into a single glance. She closed her mouth. He looked up at Vance, and his hand remained warm and steady at her back. "Harold," he said, with the tone of a man greeting someone he had known a long time and never particularly liked, "I see you've met my wife." The word landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Esther felt it ripple out around her, watched Vance's expression shift from predatory interest to something more cautious. "Your wife," Vance repeated. "That's right." The man's hand did not move from her back. He looked at Esther with an expression of such convincing warmth that she felt it somewhere in her sternum. "Esther," he said softly, and the sound of her own name in his mouth startled her. How did he know her name? And then she remembered she had said it herself, not 2 minutes ago, and this man had been close enough to the door to have heard it before he walked in. He was clever. Whatever else he was very clever. "Elias," she said, and she had no idea where the name came from, some instinct, some certainty that it suited him, but the name fell naturally from her lips as though she had been saying it for years. Something moved through his dark eyes. Surprise, she thought, and then amusement, and then something else she could not quite name. "I told you to wait at the hotel," he said gently, with the tone of a husband who was fond enough of his wife to forgive her for not listening. "I was hungry," she said. Vance was watching this exchange with the expression of a man who was calculating odds. Whatever he concluded, he evidently decided they did not favor him, because he straightened up from the bar and settled his hat on his head. "Fairchild," he said, with the particular flatness of a man acknowledging a setback. "I didn't know you'd gotten married." "Recent development," Elias Fairchild said pleasantly. Vance looked at Esther one more time with those pale eyes, then turned and walked out of the saloon with his 2 companions at his heels. The doors swung shut behind him, and the tension in the room released all at once, like a held breath. Elias Fairchild kept his hand at her back for another 10 seconds, until he was certain Vance was gone, and then he stepped back and looked at her directly for the first time. "Are you all right?" he said. "Yes," she said, and then, because it seemed the most pressing question, "Why did you do that?" "Because Vance was going to make your afternoon considerably worse than it already looked," he said. He pulled off his hat and ran a hand through his dark hair. Up close, she could see that his eyes were not simply dark but a deep, warm brown, like the color of good earth after rain. He's a dangerous man. He has been known to take advantage of women traveling alone. He has a badge, Esther said. Yes, Elias said, with a weight of meaning in that single syllable that told her everything about how much the badge was worth. He does. She studied him for a moment. He stood there without fidgeting, without the preening self-consciousness of a man who expected to be thanked. He was simply there, solid and matter-of-fact, waiting for whatever came next. Elias Fairchild, she said. Is that your real name? It is, he said. He held out his hand. I work a cattle operation about 8 miles east of town. I brought a small herd in this morning to sell, and I need to collect payment from the buyer, which should take me until late afternoon. After that, I was planning to head back. He paused. You looked like you needed a reason to be unavailable. That is an understatement, Esther said. She took his hand. His grip was firm and unhurried. Esther Harper, I arrived on the noon stage. I was supposed to have a teaching position in Millbrook. Something shifted in his expression. Millbrook burned, he said. Yes, I discovered that approximately 15 minutes ago. She straightened on her stool. I'm attempting to determine my options, which currently are limited. Elias replaced his hat on his head and seemed to think for a moment. Then he sat down on the stool beside her. What are your options as you see them? He said. It was such a practical question, and it was asked with such genuine interest rather than condescension, that Esther found herself answering honestly. I can wait until Thursday and take the stage back to Wichita, she said. Though what I'll do in Wichita with $17 and no connections is unclear. I can attempt to find work here in Caldwell, though the nature of the employment available to single women in a cattle town is not what I was trained for. Or I can find my Uncle Bernard, who may or may not still be in the territory, and who may or may not have any solutions to offer. Elias absorbed this. Bernard Harper, he said, with the tone of a man accessing a filing cabinet. He lives about 4 miles outside of Millbrook. His property didn't burn. He's had some trouble recently, though. His foreman quit, 2 of his hands left with him, and he's been struggling to keep the operation going. Esther looked at him sharply. You know my uncle. I know most people in this part of Kansas, Elias said simply. I've bought cattle from Bernard a couple of times over the years. He's a decent man. He's been in over his head since his foreman left in the spring. He paused. He talks about a niece in Boston, writes to her, is very proud of her. Something warm and aching pressed against the back of Esther's throat. He writes to me, she said. Though his last letter was in December. He's had a hard year, Elias said. I'm not surprised the letters slowed down. Esther looked at the bowl of beef stew in front of her, which she had barely touched. She picked up her spoon. She needed to eat and think clearly, and she needed to do both at the same time. You should go see him, Elias said. He'll want to know you're here, regardless of what happened to Millbrook. I don't have a way to get out to his property, Esther said. Elias was quiet for a moment. I pass close enough to his land on the way back to my own. I could take you. She looked at him. He met her gaze directly. There was nothing in his face that she could find to distrust, no calculation, no undercurrent of the kind she had felt immediately and viscerally from Harold Vance. He was simply a man who had seen a problem and was offering a straightforward solution, the way a person might hold open a door. You don't know me, she said. You don't know me either, he agreed. But I gave you my name in front of a room full of witnesses, so if I turn out to be dishonest, you'll know exactly who to blame. Despite everything, she laughed. It was a small laugh, surprised out of her, but it was real. All right, Mr. Fairchild, she said. That is a reasonable argument. Elias, he said. Elias, she repeated. And there was that sensation again, the one she had felt when she said his name the first time in the saloon. Like it belonged in her mouth. Like she had been saying it a long time. He went to conduct his business with the cattle buyer, and Esther finished her stew and persuaded the bartender, whose name was Owen, and who turned out to be considerably friendlier once the shadow of Harold Vance had left the room, to let her sit in the cooler back room until Elias returned. Owen told her, in the way of men who are lonely and like to talk, that Elias Fairchild was well regarded in Caldwell, that he had come to Kansas 4 years ago from Missouri with nothing but a small stake of money and an exceptional ability to manage cattle, and had built himself a working ranch through what appeared to be pure stubborn determination. He was not rich by any measure that Boston would have recognized, but he owned his land outright, and his cattle were healthy, and his word was good. "He's a straight shooter," Owen said, which Esther gathered was the highest compliment available in this particular vocabulary. When Elias came back at 4:30, he had a receipt folded in his shirt pocket and 2 horses waiting outside. "I borrowed a horse for you from the livery," he said. "I'll return it on my next trip to town." Esther looked at the horse, which was a gentle-looking bay mare with kind eyes, and then looked at her skirts. She had not ridden in years, and she had never ridden astride, but she was not going to tell him that. She managed. The mare was patient with her, and Elias rode beside her without comment on her form, only adjusting his pace to match hers without making it obvious that he was doing so. They rode out of Caldwell in the long golden light of the late afternoon, heading east, and the town fell away behind them and the prairie opened up ahead, vast and rolling and impossibly beautiful in a way that Esther had not expected. She had not expected Kansas at all, she realized. She had expected something barren and rough, something to be endured on the way to a practical future. What she found instead was a sky so wide it felt like it had been opened just for her, and grass that moved in the wind like the surface of a green-gold sea, and the smell of sage and dry earth and something clean that she did not have a name for. "You're looking at it like you've never seen open country before," Elias said. "I haven't," she said. "Not like this. Boston has parks, but a park is not this." "No," he agreed, and there was a quiet pride in his voice that she suspected he was not entirely aware of. They rode in a silence that was not uncomfortable. She found that she was noticing things about him. The way he sat his horse like an extension of it, the way his hat brim caught the late light and threw a shadow across his jaw, the particular quality of stillness he had that was not emptiness but something more like patience. "I need to ask you something," she said, after they had been riding perhaps 20 minutes. "Go ahead," he said. "In the saloon you called me your wife before you knew anything about me. Why?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at the horizon ahead of them. "I heard you say your name," he said. "I saw Vance's posture. I've seen that posture before, and I know what comes after it. And you were sitting there with your chin up and your back straight and your eyes completely steady, trying to handle a situation that could turn bad in about 30 seconds. He glanced at her. "I didn't think about it. I just did it. And if I had corrected you," she said, "told him you were mistaken," he almost smiled. "I figured if you were smart enough to get from Boston to Kansas by yourself with a carpetbag and your chin in the air, you were smart enough to understand what I was offering." Esther looked at the prairie ahead of them and felt something settle in her chest that she did not immediately know what to do with. "It was a risk," she said. "Most useful things are," he said. They reached her uncle's property as the sun was touching the horizon and painting the sky in colors that Esther had previously only seen in paintings by artists who she had assumed were exaggerating. Bernard Harper came out of his farmhouse door before they had finished dismounting, a stout man with a white beard and his niece's same dark eyes, and when he recognized Esther he made a sound in his throat like something had just been restored to him that he had given up on. "Esther," he said, and took both her hands in his. "Lord above, child, you're here. You're actually here." "I'm here, Uncle Bernard," she said, and her composure, which had held through the entire long, terrible, extraordinary day, cracked just slightly at the edges. He fed them supper, salt pork and cornbread and preserved peaches that were the sweetest thing Esther had tasted in months, and explained the situation with the ranch, which was exactly as Elias had described. 3 men had left in the spring. Bernard was managing alone. He was 61 years old, and it was too much. "I wrote to you about the teaching position in Millbrook because I thought you needed a landing place," Bernard said. I didn't know Millbrook would burn. I didn't know how to write and tell you it was gone." He shook his head. "I should have found a way. I'm sorry, Esther." "Don't be sorry," she said. "I'm here. Let's figure out what comes next." What came next, it emerged, was a conversation between Bernard and Elias that Esther sat through with growing attention, in which Elias offered to help Bernard find two reliable hands to replace the ones who had left, and discuss the practical requirements of keeping the operation running through the coming winter. Elias spoke with the confident precision of a man who understood ranching not as a business but as a living system. The cattle, the land, the weather, the timing, all interconnected, and Bernard listened with the respect of a man who recognized competence when he was confronted with it. At the end of the conversation, Bernard offered Elias the use of his spare room rather than have him ride 8 miles home in the dark, and Elias accepted with the practicality of a man who knew when an offer made sense. Esther was given the room that had been used as Bernard's sitting room, with a narrow bed brought in from storage, and she lay in the darkness listening to the sounds of the Kansas night crickets and a distant coyote, and the settling sounds of an old farmhouse, and thought about the extraordinary series of events that had brought her from the Caldwell stage depot to this bed, and thought about Elias Fairchild, who had called her his wife before he had exchanged 10 words with her, and had not made her feel anything except safe. She told herself, with the reasonable part of her mind, that she knew nothing about him and had known him for approximately 6 hours, and that whatever warmth she felt in his vicinity was the natural result of gratitude and exhaustion and a very frightening afternoon. She told herself this firmly. The unreasonable part of her mind, which had a habit of being more accurate than the reasonable part, said simply, "You are going to love him." She went to sleep before she could argue with herself about it further. In the morning, Elias was already up when she came out to the kitchen, and he had made coffee, real coffee, not the ersatz grain and chicory blend that Bernard kept, and he handed her a cup without asking how she took it, and it happened to be exactly how she took it, which was black with no sugar, and she looked at him over the rim of the cup and said, "Did you guess?" "No," he said with that almost smile. "Your expression yesterday when the bartender offered to add sugar to your stew. You looked at him like he'd suggested something unreasonable." She had not realized he had been watching her that closely. She decided she was not going to think too carefully about what that meant. He stayed for most of the morning, helping Bernard repair a section of fence on the south pasture. Esther, who was not a woman who sat idle when there was work to be done, helped her uncle's single remaining hand, a weathered young man named Pete, who could not have been more than 20, and who looked at Esther with the shy reverence of someone who did not encounter women from Boston very often. Organized the storage room where feed and equipment were kept in a state that suggested Bernard's record-keeping had deteriorated along with his workforce. She found, sorting through Bernard's supply ledgers, that her uncle owed money to the feed merchant in Caldwell, that he was behind on his property tax, and that his cattle numbers had declined more than he had let on at supper. She sat with the ledgers for an hour and worked the figures until she had a clear picture of where things stood, and then she went and found Bernard at the fence line and presented him with her conclusions with the directness her mother had always called her most valuable quality. Bernard looked at the figures she had written on a clean page of paper and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your father was the teacher, but your mother was the one who could make numbers behave." "She taught me," Esther said. "The situation is manageable, Uncle Bernard, but only if we act quickly. The property tax is the most urgent problem." "I know," he said. He rubbed the back of his neck. "I've been avoiding looking at it directly." "Looking away from it doesn't make it smaller," she said gently. Bernard looked at her with his dark eyes, which were very like hers, and smiled. "No," he said, "it doesn't. Your mother used to say exactly that." By the time Elias came in from the fence work for the midday meal, Esther had drafted a letter to the county tax office requesting a 30-day extension, had organized the ledgers into a coherent system, and had identified 2 possible buyers for a portion of the herd that would cover the feed debt. She showed Elias the buyers' names over bread and cheese at the kitchen table. He read through her notes and looked up at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Something that was not quite surprise but was in the same neighborhood. "You know cattle buyers," he said. "I know paperwork," she said. "I found the names in Bernard's correspondence. Both of them have bought from him before and paid promptly." He looked at the notes again. "This one is in Wichita," he said. "His price will be lower because of the distance." "I know," she said, "but he's more reliable than this one based on the payment records. Lower price paid on time is better than higher price that takes 6 months to collect." Elias set the paper down. "You figured all of this out this morning," he said. "I had good ledgers to work from," she said, which was not entirely true since Bernard's ledgers had been a moderate disaster, but modesty seemed appropriate. He was quiet for a moment in a way that had a particular quality to it, a thinking quality, not an uncomfortable one. Then he said, "I'm going to need to come back out here next week to help Bernard find those hands. It would help to have someone who can manage the paperwork side of hiring." Esther looked at him steadily. "Is that a genuine need," she said, "or a kind offer dressed up as one?" He met her gaze. "Both," he said, "in equal measure." She appreciated his honesty enough not to argue with it. He left that afternoon, and the absence of him was a particular kind of quiet that Esther noticed without meaning to. She spent the rest of the day working with Pete on the storage room and had supper with Bernard, who told her stories about his early years in Kansas and about her father as a young man. And she went to bed feeling, for the first time since her mother's death, like she was somewhere that could become home. Elias came back on Wednesday, as he had said he would, with 2 men in tow that he had found through his own connections, brothers named Thomas and Sam Rays, 25 and 22 respectively, who were experienced hands, and whose references Elias had apparently checked with the thoroughness of a man who understood that the people who worked your land were as important as the land itself. Esther conducted what she privately thought of as the paperwork portion of the hiring, writing out the terms of employment in clear language and having all parties sign, which Bernard had never done before, and which seemed to give both brothers a respect for the arrangement that a handshake alone might not have anchored. Thomas Rays, the elder brother, had a quiet directness that reminded Esther of Elias. Sam was louder and had a sense of humor that he deployed primarily against himself, which Esther found she liked. By supper, the 2 brothers were telling stories about a cattle drive that had gone sideways in the Texas Panhandle, and Bernard was laughing in the way he had not laughed when Esther first arrived, and Pete had relaxed enough to contribute his own story about a horse that had opinions about thunderstorms, and it felt very much like the beginning of something being repaired. Elias sat across the table from Esther and watched all of this with a quiet satisfaction that she did not think he was aware of showing. Once, in the middle of Sam Rays's account of the cattle drive, Elias looked up and found Esther watching him, and the look that passed between them lasted perhaps 2 seconds and said quite a lot without either of them intending it to. After supper, when Bernard and the Rays brothers had gone to sort out sleeping arrangements and Pete had retreated to the bunkhouse, Esther and Elias found themselves standing on the porch in the evening air. The sky was enormous and very dark and full of stars in a quantity that Boston's gaslit streets had made impossible to see. "You're staying again," she said. "Bernard asked," he said, "and the ride back in the dark is not practical." "No," she agreed. They were quiet for a while, which was a comfortable kind of quiet. A great horned owl called from somewhere in the cottonwoods near the creek, and something rustled in the grass beyond the fence line. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can ask," she said. He leaned against the porch railing and looked at the stars. "What will you do if the teaching position doesn't materialize, if Millbrook doesn't rebuild quickly enough?" "I don't know," she said honestly. "Stay here and help Bernard for now. Beyond that, I'm less certain." "You have skills beyond teaching," he said, "the way you worked through those ledgers." Most people with a teaching certificate wouldn't have done what you did with Bernard's books. My mother ran our household accounts from the time my father fell ill, she said. She taught me. She said a woman who didn't understand her own finances was a woman dependent on someone else's goodwill for survival, and goodwill was not a reliable resource. Elias was quiet in the particular way he had when something had reached him. She sounds like she was an exceptional woman, he said. She was, Esther said. The grief was there, but it was clean now rather than raw, the way grief sometimes settled into something bearable after enough time. She died in March. My father the November before that. I'm sorry, he said, and the simple directness of it without qualification or platitude hit her in the chest. Thank you, she said. Another silence, and the owl called again. My parents died when I was 19, he said. Fever in Missouri. It took my mother in October and my father by Christmas. I had a younger sister. Had, Esther noted, in the careful way she had learned to notice that particular tense. She died the following summer, he said, without her asking. She was 15. Some men who didn't like that our father owed them money found a way to make sure the debt died with the family. His voice was level, but there was something underneath it like dark water. After that I came west. There was nothing to stay for. Esther looked at the side of his face, at the clean jaw and the line of his throat and the steadiness of his eyes on the stars. And you built something here, she said. Tried to, he said. Still trying. She understood, with the certainty she had learned to trust in herself, that this was not a man who talked about these things easily or often, and that the fact that he had told her was significant. She did not know what to do with that significance yet, so she simply let it be. The stars are something out here, she said. Yes, he said, and she could hear the smile in it. They are. Over the following 3 weeks, Elias came to Bernard's property 4 more times. Each visit had a practical purpose, checking on the new hands, helping Bernard assess the cattle before the fall, accompanying Bernard to Caldwell to speak with the feed merchant about the debt. But the practical purposes and the other thing, the thing that was building between Elias and Esther like a slow and inevitable tide, were both simultaneously real. Esther was not naive enough to pretend she did not see it, and she was not cowardly enough to run from it, but she was careful with it, turning it over in her mind in the evenings the way she turned over problems in her ledgers, looking at it from every angle. He was good. That was the thing she kept returning to. Not good in the simple sense of the word, not merely pleasant or well-behaved, but good in the deep structural sense. The way a building is good when its foundations are honest and its walls are true. She had watched him with the Ray's brothers and with Pete and with Bernard and with the cattle and with the feed merchant, who had been inclined to be difficult until Elias introduced himself and made it clear in a voice that did not raise and did not threaten that the debt would be settled and the relationship preserved. She had watched him with a stray dog that appeared one morning from nowhere and that he fed from his own meal without comment. She had watched him read. He carried a battered almanac that he consulted with the seriousness most people reserve for scripture. And she had watched him at the fence line, working with a focus and a physical ease that she found, to her own private embarrassment, extremely distracting. She was not, she told herself, a woman who made decisions about men based on how they looked at a fence line. She was a woman who made decisions based on character and compatibility and practical sense. She was also a woman who was 23 years old and had been lonely for a very long time, and Elias Fairchild made the loneliness stop, and that was not a small thing. On the 3rd of September, which was a Tuesday, he came to Bernard's property in the morning and went directly to find her, not Bernard. She was in the garden. She had discovered in her first week that Bernard's kitchen garden was in a state of benign neglect and had appointed herself its rescuer, and she heard his boots on the path and looked up. He was standing at the garden gate with his hat in his hands, which was unusual. He almost always wore his hat. "Esther," he said. She straightened up. There was something in his voice that was different from its usual steady ease, something tightly wound. "What's happened?" she said. "Nothing's happened," he said. I need to talk to you about something." She set down her trowel and came to the gate and looked at him. His jaw was set and his dark eyes were direct, and she realized that whatever this was, he had been working himself up to it, and that was not something she had seen from him before. "Vance came to see me yesterday," he said. Esther's stomach tightened. "Vance," she repeated. "He rode out to my ranch," Elias said. "He wanted to discuss a number of things, but the main thing he wanted to discuss was you." He paused. "He has apparently made inquiries in Caldwell and in Wichita and discovered that you are not, in fact, my wife." The garden was quiet. Somewhere behind the house, Sam Rays was singing to himself off-key. "I see," Esther said. "He is planning to come here," Elias said. "To Bernard's property. He has some jurisdiction claim through the county. I'm not certain how legal it actually is, but Vance has a way of making his own law feel inevitable." He stopped. "He made comments about your situation. A woman alone, no permanent position, no legal connection to anyone in the territory. He made it sound like he intends to be a problem." Esther's chin came up. "Then we need a solution," she said. Elias looked at her for a long moment. His hands were working the brim of his hat in a way that was the only sign of agitation in his otherwise still exterior. "Esther," he said, "I know you've been here less than a month. I know you came here for a teaching position that no longer exists, and I know your plans are not settled, and I know we have not, that is, I haven't." He stopped himself, pressed his lips together, started again. "I have been trying to think of the right way to say something to you for the better part of 2 weeks, and I haven't found it, so I'm going to say it plainly, which is the only way I actually know how to say anything." "All right," she said. "I want to marry you," he said. "Not because of Vance. Because I have been at this ranch by myself for 4 years and I have not minded it. And then I met you and I started minding it considerably, and that tells me something important." He held her gaze without flinching. "I know that I introduced you as my wife before I had any right to, and I know you never corrected me, and I've been wondering what that means ever since. And I'd like to know, if you're willing to tell me." The garden, the September morning, the sound of Sam Rays singing off-key, and the distant low sound of cattle somewhere in the south pasture, all of it was very still around her. She looked at Elias Fairchild, who had walked into a dangerous situation for a stranger and given her his name and his protection and his honesty and 3 weeks of his careful, genuine attention. And she thought about her mother saying that goodwill was not a reliable resource, and she thought that this was not goodwill. This was something else entirely, something that felt as solid and reliable as the Kansas earth under her feet. "I didn't correct you," she said, "because it felt true." He let out a breath that he had clearly been holding for some time. "That's what I was hoping you'd say," he said. She stepped through the garden gate. "How soon would it need to happen? Because of Vance." "There's a circuit preacher who comes through Caldwell on the 8th, he said. "Bernard knows him." "The 8th is 5 days from now," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked at him steadily. "Elias, I am going to need you to understand something." "Tell me," he said. "I did not come to Kansas to find a husband," she said. "I came here to build something for myself. I intend to go on building it, husband or not. I have opinions and I will express them. I manage accounts and I intend to keep doing so. I want to teach, and when Millbrook or somewhere else needs a teacher, I intend to take that position. I am not going to become a decorative addition to your household." "I know," he said, and there was something in the simplicity of it that was enormously persuasive. "Esther, I heard you explaining to your uncle that looking away from a problem doesn't make it smaller. I watched you reorganize his books in a morning. I've talked to you about cattle and drought and frontier law and whether Shakespearean tragedy is as satisfying as comedy." A pause. "I don't want a decorative addition. I want the person I've been talking to for 3 weeks." She studied him for another moment. "All right," she said. He stared at her. "All right," he repeated. "Yes," she said. "All right, I'll marry you on the 8th. He was quiet for a second in a way that she thought might be relief so large it had temporarily disconnected from language. Then he said, "I should have asked you before I told everyone you were my wife." "Yes," she agreed, "you should have." "I'm sorry about that," he said, and he clearly meant it. "No, you're not," she said with a small smile. "It worked out." Something broke open in his expression then, some held-back quality releasing, and he smiled at her. A real full smile, not the almost smile she had been cataloging since the first day, and it transformed his face entirely and did something immediate and irreversible to her heart. "It did work out," he said. Bernard, when they told him over dinner, burst into tears of such unabashed joy that Sam Reyes and Pete, who were both present, spent the remainder of the meal in a state of confused but sympathetic emotion. Thomas Reyes, more composed, shook Elias' hand with an expression of genuine approval and then turned to Esther and said, "He's been a different man the last 3 weeks. Anybody who knows him knows that." "Thomas," Elias said. "I'm just saying what's true," Thomas said unrepentantly. The 5 days between the agreement and the marriage were full of practical matters: a trip to Caldwell for the license, a letter from Bernard to the circuit preacher confirming arrangements, Esther writing to the 2 acquaintances she had in Wichita to inform them of her change in circumstance, and the quiet necessary work of 2 people deciding to build a life together, which required a great many conversations. They had them. Long conversations at the kitchen table after supper, sitting across from each other while the lamp burned low, talking about everything: how the ranch worked, what Elias' intentions were for expanding the herd, what Esther knew about record-keeping for agricultural operations, what she had read and what he had read, and where they disagreed, which was frequently and productively. They argued about Shakespeare. Elias had, improbably, read quite a lot of it, having had a mother who regarded it as essential, and about the proper management of a kitchen garden, and about the merits of a particular method of cattle vaccination that was being discussed in agricultural circulars. They did not agree on everything, but they agreed on the important things, and on the things they did not agree on they were both willing to be convinced by a better argument. On the evening of the 5th of September, 3 days before the wedding, they were sitting on Bernard's porch after supper, and the conversation had run quiet in the comfortable way it sometimes did, and Elias said, without looking at her, "I want you to know that I'm going to try very hard to be the kind of husband you can rely on." Esther looked at him. "I don't come to this with any particular experience," he said carefully. "I haven't. There hasn't been, that is to say, I haven't been in the way of forming attachments these last years." "Nor have I," she said. He looked at her then. "No, I was busy," she said dryly, "taking care of my parents, learning accounts, reading Shakespeare. There was not a great deal of time for attachments." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm glad," he said. "That sounds selfish." "It sounds honest," she said, "which is what I expect from you." "Yes," he said, "that's what you'll get." The air between them was warm and still, and he reached over and took her hand where it rested on the arm of her chair, and she did not pull it away. His hand was large and calloused and very warm, and her own hand in it felt exactly right, which was the kind of thing she had read about in novels and had not entirely believed until this moment. "Elias," she said. "Yes." "When you introduced me as your wife," she said, "the first time in the saloon, what made you so certain I wouldn't simply contradict you and walk away?" He thought about this seriously, the way he thought about everything. "I wasn't certain," he said, "but I had a feeling about you." "What kind of feeling?" "The kind that's difficult to put in words," he said. "You were sitting there with your back straight and your chin up in a situation that would have made most people fold, and you were holding yourself together with what looked like pure determination, and something in my chest said," he paused, "said that I wanted to be between you and whatever was threatening that I wanted to be on your side, a beat, and that you'd understand, even if you were angry about how I went about it." Esther considered the fact that he had read her accurately from a distance before she had said more than a dozen words. "I wasn't angry," she said. "I know," he said. "That was the other thing. You weren't angry, you stepped into it. You called me by name before I told you my name." "Elias," she said, because she wanted to say it again. "It suited you." His hand tightened slightly around hers. "You suit me," he said quietly. "All of you. All the parts you listed at the garden gate, the opinions and the accounts and the teaching, all of it." She turned to look at him, and he was already looking at her, and the distance between them on the porch was not very great, and it diminished slightly, and then a little more, and then he kissed her with a gentleness and a sureness that said everything about the kind of man he was. When they separated, the Kansas sky above them was full of stars, and the cricket sound was very loud, and the great horned owl was somewhere in the cottonwoods again, and Esther thought, "This is exactly where I am supposed to be." The wedding on the 8th was small and entirely genuine. The circuit preacher was a lean man named Reverend Caldwell, no relation to the town, with kind eyes and a voice that could fill a room without effort. And Bernard's farmhouse kitchen held the wedding party, which consisted of Bernard himself, Thomas and Sam Rays, Pete, and the preacher. Pete had picked wildflowers from the creek bank, purple and yellow and white, and put them in a canning jar, which Esther thought was one of the most touching things anyone had ever done for her. Esther wore her good dress, the one she had brought from Boston, which was dark blue wool and had been worn to enough serious occasions to understand the assignment. Elias had clearly made an effort. His shirt was clean, his boots were polished, and he had gotten a haircut in Caldwell the day before, which made him look somewhat more formal but still entirely himself. They stood across from each other in the kitchen, while the September light came through the windows and the jar of wildflowers sat on the table, and they said the words, and Esther meant every single one of them with a conviction that surprised her by its depth. When the preacher said Elias might kiss his bride, Elias cupped her face in both his hands in a gesture that was so tender it made Bernard make the noise again, the one he had made when they told him they were getting married, and kissed her in front of everyone with his eyes closed, and she kept hers open for a moment just to see his face, and then closed them too. Sam Rays whooped. Thomas elbowed him. Pete's ears turned red. They moved to Elias' ranch the next day. Esther had seen it once briefly in the first week, but she looked at it differently now, with ownership eyes rather than visitor eyes. It was not large, a solid farmhouse, a barn, 2 corrals, a bunkhouse for the hands, a kitchen garden that was in reasonable but not excellent condition. But it was built with care, and it sat well in the landscape, facing south to catch the light, with a stand of cottonwood trees along the creek at the eastern edge of the property that turned gold in the autumn. She stood in the doorway of the house and looked at it, and then turned around and looked at Elias, who was watching her with an expression that had a quality of held breath to it, as though he was waiting for judgment. "The kitchen garden needs work," she said. He exhaled. "I know," he said. "I'll need a desk," she said, "for the accounts." "There's one in the back bedroom," he said. "It's not much, but it'll do," she said. And Elias, "Yes. It's a good house," she said. "You built it well." The relief and pride that moved through his face were equally large and equally unguarded. "Thank you," he said quietly, like she had given him something. The first months of their marriage were everything marriage was supposed to be, and also everything it actually was, which is to say, both more romantic and more mundane than anyone had ever adequately described. There were evenings of extraordinary tenderness and mornings of practical negotiation about who would manage what part of the operation. There were discoveries, constant discoveries of the kind that come when two people who have been alone begin to share a life. The way he made coffee in the morning strong, methodical in a particular order. The way she organized papers by date first, then subject. The way he read with his finger tracing the line, which she had never seen another adult do and which she found inexplicably dear. Harold Vance appeared at the ranch boundary once, in late October. He sat on his horse at the property line and looked toward the house, and Elias went out to meet him with a simple steadiness, and Esther watched from the porch. The conversation was brief. When Vance rode away, he did not look back and he did not return. "What did you say to him?" Esther asked. "I told him we were married and showed him the license," Elias said. "And I told him that if he came near my property again, I would file a formal complaint with the county sheriff and the territorial marshal, and that I had enough documentation of his previous conduct to make that complaint very interesting. He paused, and then I told him to have a good day. You documented his conduct, she said. You're not the only one who understands paperwork, he said. She looked at him for a moment and then laughed, and he looked pleased with himself in a way that was entirely warranted. The winter of 1878 was hard, as Kansas winters tended to be, with a late November blizzard that kept them confined to the house for 4 days, and tested both the structure of the building and the adaptability of their new marriage. By the end of the second day of confinement, Esther had reorganized the entire record-keeping system for the ranch, read through all of Elias' agricultural almanacs, and 2 novels she had found in a crate under the bed that turned out to be his, and introduced him to the argument she had with herself periodically about whether King Lear was a play about ingratitude or a play about age, which occupied them for most of the 3rd day. By the 4th day, confined to each other's company without external interruption, they had both reached a kind of knowledge of each other that usually took much longer to arrive at a fluency, a comfort, a way of being in the same room that required no performance. He had fallen, she noticed, into the habit of reading aloud to her from the almanac, which was not inherently romantic material, but which he delivered with a commentary that made it so. She had fallen into the habit of thinking out loud when she was working through a problem, which she had never done before because there had been no one to think out loud to, and he listened with genuine attention, and occasionally said something that shifted her thinking in a useful direction. When the blizzard broke and the light came back, they stood on the porch together in the cold air and watched the snow shine, and Elias put his arm around her and she leaned into his side, and it was simple and complete. I like being married to you, she said, and it was the plainest thing she had ever said and also the truest. I like being married to you too, he said. More than I expected to, and I expected to like it a great deal. She tipped her head to look up at him. High praise, she said. You've earned it, he said. In January, Esther wrote to the Territorial School Board in Topeka about the teaching position. Millbrook was beginning to rebuild. The fire had cleared away some of the disorder of the early settlement, and what was coming up in its place was more deliberately planned. And the new school board had written to Bernard asking if he knew of any qualified teachers in the area. Bernard had forwarded the letter to Esther with a note in his handwriting that said simply, I told them I might know someone. She discussed it with Elias that evening. Millbrook is 12 miles, she said. I could not do it every day. No, he agreed. But if the school board would consider a Thursday through Saturday arrangement, she said, with a room in Millbrook during those days and the rest of the week here, it could work. It could, he said. You're not going to try to talk me out of it, she said. It was not quite a question. No, he said. Did you think I would? I thought you might have some practical objections, she said. I have practical thoughts, he said. The 12 miles is a concern in bad weather. I'd feel better if you had a reliable horse rather than the livery mare. And I'd want to know that the room in Millbrook was in a reputable household. He paused. Beyond that, this is what you came here to do. I'm not going to be the reason you don't do it. She looked at him across the table at his face in the lamplight and felt the full weight of what it meant to be with someone who actually meant what they said. I love you, she said, which she had not said before in precisely those words, and the saying of it released something in her chest. He was very still for a moment. Then he said, Esther, with a weight to it that she felt in her bones. Yes, she said. I have been in love with you, he said carefully, since you called me by name when you didn't know my name, and it has been the most pleasant inconvenience of my entire life. She was laughing before he finished the sentence, and he was smiling, and she got up from her side of the table and went around to his side, and he stood up and she put her arms around him, and he held her with the steadiness that was the most characteristic thing about him, the thing she had trusted from the very first moment. I love you, he said into her hair, all of you, all the parts. The school board in Millbrook agreed to her proposed arrangement in February, with the small adjustment that she would come Monday through Friday rather than Thursday through Saturday, and return to the ranch on weekends. The horse Elias procured for her, a steady gray mare named Birch, who was sensible and fast, and had excellent opinions about weather, became one of Esther's great loves of the frontier life. The room in Millbrook was arranged with the family of a homesteader named Clara Watts, a woman of 40 with a dry wit and 2 children who immediately attached themselves to Esther's coat hems, and who became, over the course of the spring, one of Esther's first true friends in Kansas. The school itself was small, 12 students ranging in age from 6 to 15, and the schoolhouse, newly built from the lumber of the old one, smelled of fresh pine and ambition. Esther set up her classroom with the precise intentionality of someone who had been thinking about this for years, arranged the desks in a semicircle rather than rows, because she wanted the students to be able to see each other's faces, ordered books through the Territorial Education Office, and on the first day of school stood before 12 pairs of eyes and felt, for the first time in what seemed like a very long time, exactly like herself. Elias came to Millbrook on the first Friday of the school term to collect her, and Clara Watts opened the door and looked at him for a long moment with the appraising eye of a woman who has been a friend for 3 months and reserves the right to an opinion. "You're the husband," Clara said. "I am," he said. "She talks about you," Clara said. "Clara," Esther said from behind her. "I'm just saying," Clara said, unperturbed. "Come in, Mr. Fairchild. I've made coffee." He came in and he sat in Clara's kitchen and drank coffee, and Clara asked him questions with the directness of someone who had nothing to lose, and he answered them with his characteristic steadiness. And by the end of the coffee, Clara looked at Esther across the table with an expression that said she approved. Riding home through the warm evening, Esther asked him what he thought of Clara. "I like her very much," he said. "She asked me what my intentions were in regard to your teaching career, and when I said I intended to support it fully, she looked at me for 10 seconds without speaking, which I think means I passed." "You passed," Esther confirmed. "That look means you passed." He smiled at the road ahead. "How was the first week?" she told him. "All of it, each student individually, their abilities and their gaps and the particular way each of them held a pencil. The moment on Wednesday when a boy named James Cooper had suddenly understood fractions in a way that made his whole face light up. The afternoon she had read them part of a poem, and the girl who sat in the corner, who had said not a single word in 3 days, had looked up at her with eyes that were suddenly present. Elias listened to all of it with the full quality of attention that she had come to understand was one of the most distinctive and valuable things about him. He asked questions. He remembered details she had mentioned and referenced them correctly. He was interested in the actual substance of what she was describing, not just the shape of her happiness. "You're going to be extraordinary at this," he said when she had finished. "I'm already pretty good," she said, with the directness her mother had taught her about her own competence. "Yes," he agreed, "and you're going to be extraordinary." The spring and summer of 1879 settled into a rhythm that had both the regularity of a well-run household and the variety that comes from 2 people actively building things. Esther taught school 5 days a week and managed the ranch accounts on the weekends. Elias expanded the herd, brought on a third hand, and spent a great deal of the summer working on a new fence line along the northern boundary of the property, which was the kind of long physical project that he undertook with a focused satisfaction that Esther found she liked to watch through the kitchen window while she was working at the desk. In June, Thomas Reyes came to them with the information that he intended to ask Sam's help to start his own small operation on a piece of land to the east, and that he was giving notice, but wanted to be sure the transition was smooth. Elias responded to this news with genuine pleasure rather than the resentment of an employer losing a valuable hand, helped Thomas identify the most appropriate land parcel, wrote a letter of recommendation for the bank loan, and threw a supper party in their honor that ended with Sam playing a battered guitar on the porch and everyone, including Esther, attempting to learn a Mexican folk song that Sam insisted was not as difficult as they were making it look. It was an evening Esther would remember for the rest of her life. The warm June night, the lantern light on the porch, Sam's guitar and everyone's imperfect voices, and Elias beside her on the porch steps with his arm around her waist, laughing at his own wrong notes. In July, Esther realized she was going to have a baby. She sat with this knowledge for 3 days before she told Elias, not because she was afraid to tell him, but because she wanted to hold it to herself for a little while, this new enormous fact, before it became something they navigated together. She thought about her parents. She thought about the tiny school in Millbrook and the 12 faces turned toward her, and the poem that had made the quiet girl look up. She thought about Elias' hand at the small of her back in a saloon in Caldwell, 14 months ago, saying "There you are, darling," as though he had always known her. She told him on a Sunday morning when they were at breakfast, and the light was coming through the east window the way it did in late July, golden and horizontal and unhurried. He set down his coffee cup. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she could not entirely read. It was too large for a single emotion, too many things moving across his face at once. Then he said, "Esther." "Yes," she said. He got up from his chair and came around the table and crouched down beside her chair so that his face was level with hers, and he took both her hands in both of his. "Are you well?" he said. "Are you?" "I'm perfectly well," she said. "I'm wonderful, actually." "I know," he said, and his voice was not entirely steady. "I know you are, He stopped. "We're going to have a baby." "We are," she said. He put his forehead against her forehead, and they stayed like that for a moment in the Sunday morning light, and she felt his hands tighten around hers and felt the slight unsteadiness in his breath that was the closest she had ever seen him come to being overwhelmed. "I am going to take such good care of you," he said. "I know," she said. "And you." She pulled back slightly to look at him. "And I will continue teaching until December because I'm not going to give this to fear." "I know," he said, and she heard all his trust of her in it. "And we'll figure out the rest as we go," she said. "Yes," he said. "We will." He kissed her, long and sure and tender in the Sunday morning light. The baby was born on the 9th of February, 1880, in the middle of a Kansas winter that was cold enough to freeze the creek at the east boundary of the property. The midwife was a woman named Hattie Boone, who had been delivering babies in Sumner County for 20 years, and who arrived at the house with the combination of calm authority and practical competence that Esther had learned to value above almost everything else in the frontier world. It was a long labor, and it was hard, and Elias spent most of it in the kitchen with the useful uselessness of a man who would have done anything he was asked to do, but was not asked to do anything except wait. He made coffee that no one drank and chopped wood that was not needed, and paced the length of the kitchen approximately 400 times, and when Hattie Boone came out and said that Esther was well and so was the baby, he had to grip the kitchen table with both hands to stay upright. The baby was a boy. He had a great deal of dark hair and Elias' jaw and Esther's eyes, and he weighed 8 pounds 4 ounces according to Hattie's scale, and he announced his arrival with a volume that Hattie said was a very good sign. Elias sat beside Esther on the bed with his son in his arms and looked at him with an expression that was beyond anything Esther had seen on his face before, a look of such astonished, helpless love that it made her throat ache. "He's so small," Elias said. "He's enormous," Hattie corrected from the doorway. 8 pounds 4 is not small, Mr. Fairchild. Your wife worked very hard today." Elias looked at Esther with that overwhelming expression redirected entirely at her. "I know she did," he said quietly. "What will you name him?" Hattie asked. Esther looked at the baby, their baby, this particular face that was neither of them but somehow both of them, and then looked at Elias. They had discussed names in a general way, in the way of people who are careful not to plan too specifically for something that could yet go wrong, but they had not decided. "William," Esther said, "for my father." Elias looked at her. "William," he said, and she heard in his voice the same thing she had heard when she said his name the first time, rightness. "William Fairchild," he said. The baby, perhaps recognizing the significance of the moment, made a small sound that could generously be interpreted as agreement. Bernard came to see the baby on the 12th of February, riding out despite the cold with a crate of preserved goods and a hand-knitted blanket made by the wife of one of his new hands. He held William with the careful reverence of a man who understood the weight of what he was holding, and looked at Esther with such love and pride that she had to look away to keep herself composed. "Your mother would have been so happy," Bernard said. "Your father, too. They would have been so happy, Esther." "I know," she said. "I know they would." Clara Watts came the following week with her 2 children, who were entranced by William in the way that children are by something smaller than themselves, and who argued in whispers about whether he was more like Esther or more like Elias, and reached the diplomatic conclusion that he was the best of both. Spring came, and with it the smell of thawed earth and new grass, and Esther went back to teaching in April when William was 8 weeks old, and Hattie had pronounced them both entirely healthy. She had arranged for a local woman, a quiet and competent woman named Ruth, to care for William during school days, and the first morning she rode Birch to Millbrook with the April light on the prairie and her chest still full of the weight and the warmth of her son's small body. She felt the particular good ache of a woman who has built more than one important thing and intends to tend them all. The students had made a welcome back banner, lopsided and misspelled in places and deeply sincere, and Esther looked at it for a long moment before she said anything, composing herself. "Thank you," she said. "Now, let's find out what you remember." William grew the way babies do, with a speed that was astonishing to his parents and unremarkable to everyone else who had raised children, which was almost everyone else. He was a serious baby who became a curious toddler with strong opinions about which objects in the house deserved his attention, and an apparently inexhaustible interest in the cattle, toward which he displayed the fearlessness that worried Elias and delighted Thomas Rays when he came to visit with his new wife, a quiet woman named Maria who had grown up ranching, and who recognized in William a child who understood animals. "He'll be good with them," Maria said, watching William stand at the corral fence and regard the cattle with thoughtful dark eyes. "He'd better learn to be cautious first," Elias said. "He'll learn both," Maria said. "Children with that look always do." The injustice of the frontier was not invisible to Esther, who taught children from homesteading families of every background and saw clearly which ones had more and which ones had less, and understood that this was not random but structured. She saw it in the way the cattle companies exercised power over smaller operators, in the way the law bent toward money, in the way that families who had arrived before the large land grabs had things that later arrivals could not get. She wrote letters to the territorial board about resource allocation for frontier schools. She organized collections among the Millbrook families for school supplies so that no child sat in her classroom without the materials to learn. She was not naive about the size of the problems against which she pressed, but she pressed anyway, which was all anyone could do. Elias, who had his own understanding of what it meant to build something in a system that did not particularly want you to succeed, supported all of this without reservation, and occasionally provided the kind of practical political knowledge that came from years of navigating the cattle business. Between the two of them they became, over the years, a particular kind of presence in the community, the teacher and the rancher, the woman who understood books and accounts and the man who understood land and cattle, and who together understood more than either would have alone. In the fall of 1882, Esther discovered she was expecting again. William was 2.5 and had recently learned to run, and was applying this new ability to everything. Elias, upon learning of the new baby, displayed the same response as the first time, overwhelming, barely contained emotion that expressed itself as extreme practicality, and immediately began planning the expansion of the house's second bedroom. The second child was born in April of 1883, a girl this time, with Elias' dark hair and his quiet eyes, and they named her Mary after Elias' mother, which was a decision Esther made and presented to Elias as a question, and which undid him completely and quietly in the way that the most significant kindnesses always did. William, presented with his sister, studied her for a long time with the same serious expression he used for the cattle, and then declared that she was acceptable. This assessment remained his operating position on Mary for approximately 3 weeks, at which point he became her most devoted protector and spent the better part of their childhood defending her from every perceived threat up to and including a particularly aggressive rooster. By 1885, the ranch had grown into a genuinely sound operation. Elias had expanded the herd steadily, acquired an additional 20 acres along the eastern fence line, and built 2 new structures, a proper storage barn and a larger bunkhouse that testified to the accumulated work of 7 years. The farmhouse had grown with the family, a new bedroom added, the kitchen extended, the porch rebuilt wider so that it caught the evening light on both sides. Esther had been teaching in Millbrook for 6 years, and the school had grown from 12 students to 28, which necessitated a petition to the school board for an additional teacher, which Esther wrote with the precision of someone who had been making arguments in ink for years and knew how to make them land. The board approved the position, and a young man named George Alcott arrived from Topeka with a teaching certificate and the slightly overwhelmed expression of someone encountering Esther Harper's classroom standards for the first time. He adapted quickly. He was good with the older students in ways that complemented Esther's particular strengths with the younger ones, and by the end of his first term, they had established a working partnership that ran the school with a smooth efficiency that the students, being children, primarily experienced as a lack of gaps in which to misbehave. Bernard came to supper every Sunday that weather permitted, and became, over the years, the grand-paternal figure that William and Mary treated with the particular combination of reverence and shameless manipulation that children reserve for grandparent figures. Bernard, who had never had children of his own, was entirely susceptible to this and made no attempt to resist it. By 1886, Bernard's health had begun to decline in the slow, dignified way of a man in his late 60s who has spent most of his life outdoors. He was not ill in any specific way, but he was diminishing, and both Esther and Elias could see it. They discussed it quietly between themselves, and then, with characteristic directness, discussed it with Bernard. "I think," Esther said on a Sunday evening in September, "that you should come and live here, Uncle Bernard. We have the room. The Ray's brothers are running your operation well, and Thomas can handle the management from his own property." Bernard looked at her across the table. "I don't want to impose," he said, with the stubbornness of a man who has been independent for 40 years. "You're not imposing," Elias said. "You're family." Bernard looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Esther. Then he looked at William and Mary, who were both watching him with the unself-conscious hope of children. "I could be useful," he said, with the dignity of a man negotiating terms. "You're always useful," Esther said. "You'll help with the children. William has been asking who can teach him to play chess, and I know you play." "I used to be quite good," Bernard said. "Then you'll teach him," she said. He moved in the following month. His room was the one added to the east side of the house, and he sat in it in the evenings by the window where he could see the cottonwoods along the creek, and he taught William chess and told Mary stories and was, within a month, so thoroughly woven into the fabric of the household that it seemed to everyone, including Bernard himself, that he had always been there. William, at 8, was already showing the particular combination of his parents' qualities that would define him: his father's patience and physical ease, his mother's analytical mind, and the slightly terrifying directness she had inherited from her own mother. He was good with the cattle and good with numbers, and had recently developed a passion for maps that Esther recognized as the first stirrings of a geographical imagination that was going to need feeding. She ordered him a proper atlas from the bookseller in Topeka. It arrived on a Tuesday, and he did not come to supper on time because he was still reading it. And when she found him at the kitchen table with his finger tracing the line of a river system, she stood in the doorway and watched him for a moment with a feeling in her chest so large it barely fit. Mary, at 4, was a different creature, entirely louder, more immediately emotional, faster to laugh and faster to fury, with an imagination that manifested primarily as an elaborate fictional world populated by the ranch's various animals, who in Mary's version of events had complex social relationships and political allegiances that changed weekly. She narrated this world constantly to anyone who would listen, with a conviction and a specificity that Esther recognized as storytelling ability, raw and already remarkable. "She gets that from you," Elias said once, listening to Mary's account of a power struggle between two of the ranch dogs that had apparently been ongoing for several days. "I don't tell stories," Esther said. "You make every problem you explain sound like a story," he said. "You always have." She considered this and found it was accurate and that she was oddly pleased by it. On the evening of October the 14th, 1887, which was a Friday, Elias came in from the north fence line at dusk, which was later than usual, and he was quiet at supper in a way that was different from his usual thoughtful quiet. Esther noticed but said nothing while the children were at the table, and Bernard was telling a story about a chess match he had once played in St. Louis. After the children were in bed and Bernard had retired to his room, she found Elias on the porch, standing in the dark and looking at the stars. She stood beside him. "Tell me," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I was thinking about something Thomas said today," he said. "He has a buyer who wants to purchase the northeastern quarter of his property, a large outfit from Texas. Thomas doesn't want to sell, but the price is significant and the pressure is real. The large outfits are moving north," she said. It was not new information, but the specific reality of it landing close was different from the general knowledge. "Yes," he said. "It won't stop with Thomas's quarter section." She understood what he was not quite saying. The Kansas cattle landscape was shifting in the late 1880s in ways that pressed hard on smaller operators. The open range era was ending as barbed wire carved up the prairie, and the large Texas outfits and their Kansas counterparts were in a position to absorb smaller operations or simply to make the margins unlivable. "What are you thinking?" she said. "I'm thinking about what we've built," he said, "and I'm thinking about what we need to do to protect it." They talked for 2 hours on the porch, which was not unusual for them. They went through the figures. She had the ranch accounts in her head as accurately as if the ledgers were in front of her, and identified the options. And by the end of the 2 hours, they had the shape of a plan that Elias would spend the next several months executing. It involved a land purchase to the south, which would consolidate their position, a shift in the cattle mix to focus on quality over volume, and an agreement with Thomas Rays to present a unified front on the water rights question that was emerging as the key pressure point for small operators in the county. It was practical and deliberate, and it was built on 9 years of accumulated knowledge and trust between them, and it worked. Not quickly, not without difficulty, but it worked in the way that things work when they are based on sound foundations and honest assessment. When Esther told her students in the winter of 1888 about how to solve a difficult problem, break it into what you know and what you don't know, she told them, then address what you know with what you have, and let that be the foundation from which you address the rest. She was not teaching them anything she had not lived. In the spring of 1889, Esther discovered she was expecting a third child. She was 34, and Hattie Boone was still the midwife of choice in Sumner County. And when Esther told Elias, he responded, as he had the first 2 times, with barely contained, overwhelming love that expressed itself as building something. He added a new section to the garden fence, which had needed doing for 2 years. The third child arrived in November, another boy, dark-haired like his father and sister, with Esther's steady eyes, and they named him James Bernard, the the Bernard for her uncle who was sitting in the kitchen when the baby arrived and who cried harder than anyone except possibly Elias. William, at 9, was dignified about the new baby in the manner of an oldest child who has been through this before. Mary, at 6, was entranced and immediately began including James in her fictional world, assigning him the role of the youngest and most important member of the ranch dog political alliance. James was a peaceful baby, which everyone agreed was a blessing given the energy of his older siblings, and he grew into a quiet child with a gift for making friends that neither of his parents quite understood but deeply appreciated. Every person who came to the ranch hands, neighbors, the circuit preacher, the occasional traveler left having had a conversation with James that they remembered afterward. "He gets that from you," Esther told Elias. "I'm not particularly sociable," he said. "You're kind," she said. "People always remember kindness." Bernard died in the winter of 1891, on a January night when the snow was deep and the house was warm and all of them were there. He had been declining for 2 years, slowly and without drama, in the way he had lived with dignity and practicality, and a quiet attention to the things that mattered. In his last weeks he had been mostly in his room, and each evening Esther or Elias or one of the children had sat with him, and he had told stories, and they had listened, and in this way the stories were kept. He died in his sleep, which was what he had said he wanted, and when Esther found him in the morning she stood at his bedside for a long time and held his hand and said goodbye with all the love she had for him, which was considerable. She was grateful, in the clean way of grief that has been allowed to prepare itself, that he had come to live with them, that she had known him in these last years, that William and Mary and James had known him. They buried him on the property he had loved, and the circuit preacher said words, and Sam Reyes, who had become an accomplished guitar player, played something that was not quite a hymn but was close enough, and the January sky was very wide and very blue. William, at 11, held his mother's hand during the service, because he was old enough to understand what death was and old enough to want to be useful in the face of it. Mary, at 8, stood between her parents with tears running silently down her face. James, at 2, sat in Elias' arms and was aware that something important was happening, even if he could not name it. In the years that followed, the ranch and the school and the family and the community all continued to grow in the way that things grow when they are tended with consistent attention. Not dramatically, not with great leaping bounds, but steadily, each year adding something that the year before had not had. The school in Millbrook grew to 35 students and required a second additional teacher, and Esther had by this point been teaching long enough that she was the person other teachers in the county came to with questions, which she found both humbling and entirely reasonable. Elias Ranch was, by 1895, one of the most stable small operations in Sumner County, which was not an accident and which required the kind of sustained, unglamorous work that does not make good stories in the telling but makes very good lives in the living. He had gray in his hair now, at the temples, and it suited him. Esther was 40, and she wore 40 the way she wore everything, with her back straight and her eyes direct, and a particular quality of presence that had always been her most distinctive feature. Their children were growing with the speed that children always grow, and each stage produced new wonders and new negotiations. William, at 15, was working beside his father with the ease of someone who had been learning the ranch since he could walk, and had also developed his mother's interest in figures to the point where he was the one who kept the ranch accounts in the summers. Mary, at 12, was writing stories in the margins of her school books, long, complicated stories about people in places she had never been, told with a specificity and a feeling that made her teachers keep the pages and her parents read them in the evenings with quiet astonishment. James, at 6, was at school now, in his mother's classroom, which he navigated with the diplomatic skill of someone who understood instinctively that the teacher and the mother were the same person, and that this required particular sophistication. On a summer evening in 1896, Esther and Elias sat on the porch after supper, which was where they had always gone when they needed to talk, or when they did not need to talk, both being good reasons to be on the porch. The children were inside, William reading, Mary writing, James apparently explaining something to the dog with great seriousness. The evening light was the long gold of a Kansas summer, and the cottonwoods along the creek were green, and the cattle were quiet in the south pasture. "Do you remember," Elias said, "what you thought when I put my hand on your back in that saloon?" She turned to look at him. It was a question he had never asked directly before, though they had talked around it many times in the years since. "I thought," she said, "that I had no idea who you were and that it did not seem to matter as much as it should have." He smiled. "What else?" "I thought," she said, "that I was either in a great deal of trouble or about to have a very interesting life." And he said, "Both," she said. Both things were true. He reached over and took her hand, which was something he still did, 18 years after the first time she had noticed that his hand was warm and steady and unhurried, and it had never lost that quality. His hand was still warm, still steady, still exactly the same in the way that the most reliable things are always exactly the same. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Tell me," she said. "Introducing you as my wife before I had any right to," he said, "is the best thing I have ever done by accident." She looked at him, at the face she knew better than any other face in the world, at the gray in his hair and the lines at the corners of his eyes from years of looking at the open prairie, at the particular darkness of his gaze that had been the first thing she trusted about him. "You weren't wrong," she said. "You were just early." He squeezed her hand. "You never corrected me," he said. "I know," she said. "Not once." "No," she said. "Not once." The evening settled around them, the long June evening, with the cattle sounds and the cottonwood rustle, and the sound of their children inside the house that they had built together from what had been, at the beginning, very little a borrowed name, a hand at the small of her back, and something that recognized itself across a dangerous room and decided, without asking permission, to be true. Inside the house, James had finished explaining something to the dog and was now calling for his mother in the way that 6-year-olds call, with the full expectation of the universe's immediate compliance. Mary's voice answered him before Esther could move, telling him that Mama was on the porch and that he should come himself if he needed something rather than hollering the house down. William said something that made James laugh, and then there was the sound of footsteps and the screen door opening, and James appeared with his father's dark hair and his mother's eyes, slightly out of breath from something, radiating importance. "Papa," he said, coming directly to Elias with the preference of a child who has not yet learned to distribute his crises equally. "Thomas Ray's dog had puppies. Can we have one?" Elias looked at Esther. Esther looked at Elias. Elias said, "Is your mother's decision." "Mama," James said, redirecting instantly. "Can we?" Esther regarded her youngest child, who had his father's jaw in her own eyes and his own particular gift for making people want to give him things, and thought about the fact that they had a ranch with cattle and horses and a garden and 3 children and 18 years of accumulated life, and that a puppy was really not the most complicated thing any of them had navigated. "One puppy," she said. "A small one." James made a sound of pure elation and disappeared back inside to report to his siblings, and within moments the sound of 3 children's voices could be heard in animated discussion about the respective merits of different puppies, which Mary was apparently approaching from a narrative standpoint and William from a practical one. Elias was smiling at the sound of them. Esther leaned her head against his shoulder. "One puppy," he said. "Do not start," she said. "You've always been very firm about animals," he said, with the tone of a man who is entirely aware that she had a complicated relationship with a stray cat that had appeared the previous autumn and was now definitively living in the kitchen. "Be quiet," she said, without heat. He pressed his lips to her hair. Outside, the last of the evening light was leaving the sky, and the first stars were appearing in the dark above the prairie, and the land stretched away in every direction, wide and quiet and full of the particular peace that comes not from the absence of difficulty, but from the presence of enough good things to make the difficulty worth it. This was what they had built. Not only the ranch and its fences and its cattle and its careful accounts, not only the school with its 35 students and its 2 teachers, not only the house with its added rooms and its wide porch and the new paint Elias had put on the barn last spring. They had built a life that was held together by the kind of trust that grows slowly and does not break, the kind of love that has been tested by winters and losses and hard years, and has come through them not weakened but deepened, the kind of partnership that begins when one person looks at another in a desperate moment and decides, without asking permission, to believe that something is true. She had not corrected him. Not in the saloon, not in the years since, not in the quiet of any evening when she might have looked at her life and found reasons to be uncertain. She had not corrected him because from the very first moment, some part of her had understood that the word he used was not presumption but recognition, and that the life it pointed toward was exactly the life she had come all the way from Boston to find, even though she had not known it yet. She understood it now. She turned her face against his shoulder and closed her eyes, and felt the warmth of him and the solidity of him and the whole long, beautiful history of what they were to each other, and the sound of their children inside the house that was theirs, and the smell of the Kansas evening and the first cool breath of the coming night. "Elias," she said. "Yes," he said, the way he always said yes to her, as though it were the only answer. "I'm glad you didn't ask," she said, "before you introduced me." "I'm glad you just said it." He was quiet for a moment. "So am I," he said. Inside, James was arguing cheerfully with Mary about the puppy's name, and William was mediating with the resigned competence of an oldest child who has been through this before. And the Kansas night was coming in with its stars and its cricket sound, and its enormous, indifferent, beautiful sky, and Elias Fairchild and Esther Harper sat on their porch in the dark and held hands and listened to their children, and the world was exactly as it should be.